Okie dokie. So let's kind of talk about a little bit more where we left off the other day. So we've been talking about labor in the United States, and we went over the sort of the evolution of the national unions from the first big national union, the National Labor Union, that fell apart because it sort of started buying into socialism. The Knights of Labor, who had a very extensive mission that well went beyond the the issue of mere labor relations. And finally, we got to the American Federation of Labor, which really is the most successful of any of them. They're still around today. And the fact that, as time sort of progressed here, we're looking at a situation where these unions became less and less radical and more sort of in line with the idea that maybe, endorsing private property ownership and, really rejecting the wacky nuttiness of Marxism was probably the way to go. What I want to do now, though, is look at some of the factors that really led to unions in America developing a very bad reputation and really straining the relationship between the American people and organized labor. And we're going to look at a couple of incidents in particular, but we're going to start with this one here. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So, as sort of a background to this, in the 1860s and 70s, the railroad, with the Transcontinental Railroad being completed, railroad industry really grew by leaps and bounds. And it appeared to be, it was sort of like the tech stock of its day. It was the industry to be in. This was a little misleading, however, because much of the railroad's growth was due to government involvement, government subsidies, and quite frankly, a large amount of crony capitalism. It reached the point where, in the early 1870s, banks began issuing loans to railroad entrepreneurs with very little or no collateral and not necessarily even a good business plan about what they were up to. And banks also began buying railroad stock. Now, this combination of the willingness of banks to lend money, the government funneling tons of money to transcontinental railroads, and stock being driven up in value because of this view that railroads were the thing to be involved with. Railroads by the mid 1870s had greatly expanded everywhere, so much so that there were simply now too many of them. And as the law of supply and demand tells us, when there's an overabundance of supply and an underabundance of demand, in order to attempt to generate business, prices must go down. So you may have had 15 or 20 railroads all running basically the same route, competing for business. And there may be only one or two shippers or people who need things shipped that these railroads are competing against. So they keep undercutting each other. This undercutting leads to the inability to actually make payments on loans and stock value dropping. Remember, banks are investing people's money. They are not investing their own money. The result was an economic crisis caused by the overexpansion of railroads. In 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, that's the B&O, was losing a lot of money. And in an effort to try to recoup some of these losses, they decided to cut labor costs, which is the single biggest expense that any business has. They reduced wages by half and increased working hours. The B&O's workers were not happy about this, and they decided to go on strike, which, remember, a strike is a work stoppage. The The ironic part about this is there's no union involved. This is merely the workers coming to this conclusion on their own. And the strike spread quite rapidly, largely due to the influence and presence of anarchist and socialist activists who saw this as an opportunity to strike out against the bourgeois. The strike and protests began in West Virginia. Not exactly the hotbed of, rail traffic or anything else, but it was an area that was necessary for railroads to go through, depending on where they were off to. And as a result of this, it really ground rail traffic to a halt. The B&O asked the governor of West Virginia to do something, and the governor of West Virginia sent in the West Virginia National Guard. The problem was the West Virginia National Guard was actually sympathetic to the strikers and just left and did nothing. Well, this means we got to kick it up the ladder, and the next place that they go is the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, who had been in office only about 4 months at this point. Now remember, it was Grant and during his administration that these railroads got all this subsidy and this crony capitalism that eventually led to this economic crisis because of the overexpansion of the railroads. Hayes is left to deal with it. He sends in the army. The army does successfully break up the protests in West Virginia. But by this point in time, it was a little bit too late. The protests had spread. In Maryland, in the city of Baltimore, the Maryland National Guard was sent in to deal with striking and protesting train workers who, realizing that probably the same thing would happen again, had come armed and outnumbered the National Guard and actually trapped the National Guard for like 3 days in a railroad station until the National Guard got rescued by the U.S. Army. Talk about embarrassing. Further embarrassing, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the city of Pittsburgh, strikers thought it would be a good idea to light a railroad depot on fire, maybe not considering the fact that there's coal, oil, and wood everywhere, which burned out of control, resulting in a 2-mile-long fire in the city of Pittsburgh. The end result was over 1,400 railroad cars and engines destroyed, buildings completely wiped out, and downtown Pittsburgh suffering anywhere from $5 to $10 million of back then money damage. Not to be outdone, the city of Philadelphia also had their railroad yard lit on fire. All things considered, in the space of less than 3 months, in about 6.5 to 7 weeks, President Hayes sent the army into 7 different states to put down protests and strikes on the part of workers. In the end, they successfully broke the workers, and the strike was ended. Now, there are 2 great ironies and lessons to take out of the Great Railroad Strike. Irony and lesson number 1. The unions were not at all involved with this, but they still got the blame for it. People associated the violence and the problems with the unions, even though there was no railroad union to speak of. The group that really doesn't get enough blame are the socialists, who basically just shifted blame onto the unions themselves. Second lesson to take out of this, and what is maybe even more ironic. When the strike were finally done and things calmed down, months later, the B&O and the railroad workers engaged in collective bargaining. That's where representatives sit down and talk with each other. The railroad wanted to know why the workers had reacted the way they did. And the workers explained that cut in wages and those increase in hours made it nearly impossible for them to support their families. And this was wrong. And then the workers wanted to know why the railroad decided to do what they did. And the railroad responded that they were losing money and couldn't afford to pay the workers. And then basically showed them the receipts, how much stuff was costing. After some negotiation and discussion, the B&O set up an insurance system plan for its employees as well as retirement accounts for its employees. Didn't do anything about pay increases or anything else, but it did give the employees something that they were happy with. And I think the real lesson we can take out of this is had they simply engaged in collective bargaining and arbitration to begin with, tens of millions of dollars of damages and people injured or killed could have been avoided, and a lot of lost wages that were never recovered could have kept coming in to support families. Sometimes we learn best by being hurt. Tomorrow, we'll talk about how it is that employers and businesses reacted in response to labor and its growing power in America, as well as an even bigger and more damaging strike than the Great Railroad Strike. That's the Homestead Strike of 1888, I think it is. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Peace and love.